Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the second and final section of the 16th and final module of the History of Christianity 1 course. In the previous modules, we've been working through the history of the church from the time of Christ until around the early 1500s AD. We have only surveyed the main people, events, and issues of the church in this long time period, and there's a ton of stuff we're not able to cover. But I hope in each section you've gained a general understanding of what happened and why it matters for today. And throughout this course, we've tried to learn valuable lessons from the past so that we could imitate their successes and avoid their failures. I've made no apology for trying to draw moral lessons from the past, because I believe that our God is the Lord of history, and we should evaluate it by His standards. And I also think we should learn more from history than just a bunch of trivia about what happened. If all we learn are dates and names, then we've not really learned history. But if we learn God's ways in history and live better lives because of what we've learned, then our study of history has been worthwhile. So in this section, we'll try to summarize what we've seen from history in terms of some godly principles and insights we've hopefully learned and can put into practice. We won't necessarily review all of the historical events. I hope you've been provided enough summaries and reviews throughout each module to be able to do that for yourself. Rather, I want to review some of the major lessons I hope we've learned from this examination of history. We can learn how to live today and tomorrow by learning from yesterday. We can look forward by looking back. First, I want to bring back to your attention, but not take the time to explain, some concepts we saw at the beginning of this course. First is the iceberg. Remember that people's behavior does not come out of thin air. Rather, it's built on their values, which are built on their beliefs and worldview, all of which is ultimately built on their theology. And second is this diagram, which is the same concept in the opposite direction. Our theology influences our principles and then our methods and actions. And we apply these principles possibly using different methods as we apply them in different cultures and contexts and situations. We learn general things and ideas to apply to specific situations in whatever way is most appropriate. Now, as we reach the end of this course, I want to share 3 desires I have for you at this point. First, that you would not be overwhelmed by all that you've learned. That you would not think, well, I need to evangelize the world just like the early church, and I need to be willing to die for my faith like the martyrs, and I need to stand against the world like Athanasius, and I need to be as thoughtful as Augustine, and I need to reform the church, and I need to do it all by the end of the week. Now, of course, those are all good goals to which we should all aspire. But I don't want you to put an unrealistic guilt trip on yourself because you're not doing it all. Be realistic. The world already has a Savior and does not need you to do it all. Don't think because of all the good things that you've learned that you have to do every good thing. Rather, you should be wise and ask, what is the main thing or things that you should be doing in your particular situation? Take small steps, but always work towards big goals. And that leads to my second desire for you, that you would be inspired by history, that you would dream big dreams and set big goals and pray big prayers. Remember that learning theology and history gives us clarity in order to see both the urgency and the opportunity of our situation and to make a practical strategy to respond. And I pray that you would see your God-given opportunity to make a difference and feel the urgency to do so. Because God has called you to glorify Him by being a positive agent for change in your corner of the world. Now, that might be telling your best friend about Christ, that might be raising godly children, that may be standing up for genuine biblical truth and justice in a world gone crazy, or it may be leading the next revival that wins the world for Christ. Who knows? It may be any number of things. But the more we find out who God is and what He is doing, the more we find out who we are and how we fit into His larger plans to change history for His glory. And that brings up my third desire for you from this course, that you would see God in all of history, And from that, you would learn to look for God working in your own personal history. Think back through all you've learned from the church's history and ask, what was God doing and why? Ask what kind of God he has shown himself to be. And then ask, based on what kind of God he is, what should we expect from him in our own lives? And how can we know him more and more as we live out what we've learned from history in wise, God-honoring ways? Now, those are the three big picture things that I hope and pray you've been getting out of this course. And with that in mind, I want to transition to a larger discussion of some lessons learned from this portion of history. And I'm going to do it under four headings: general goals, general dangers, general principles, and general strategy. First, under the category of general goals, I hope we will learn the following lessons about what we should be aiming for in our lives. Now, of course, we need to breathe and sleep and take in enough food and water, and we should somehow legally and morally work to provide for all that we and our loved ones need. But history teaches us that life should be so much more than just those basics. I want to summarize this in three spheres of relationship, and then in three aspects of our individual lives. There are three spheres of relationships that we should pursue. First, we should seek to know and love God, which is primarily characterized by worship and obedience. Jesus commanded us to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We should strive to be holy and conform to his image. We can do this by learning and trusting his scripture as our primary functional authority, by interacting with him in prayer, by trusting in his grace shown in Christ, and by living for his glory, among other things. Second, we should have relationship with God's people in the church. Jesus commanded us to love one another. That's characterized by all aspects of our discipleship in community. We should be the church. We should build up the church. We should be catechized and live out what we're taught. And we should evangelize and catechize others and help them to live it out. The church should also be visibly different and separate from the surrounding society, in the sense of being holy people who live by God's standards. The church should be countercultural and display a better way of living to a watching world. And that brings us to the third relationship. We should have a certain kind of relationship to the non-Christian world. Jesus commanded us to love our neighbor, and that includes loving our enemies. We should be engaged in outreach and evangelism, and that includes works of service and charity. The church needs to be salty citizens in the world, influencing the world for the better and displaying the glory of God for all to see. Now that means we should be genuine Christians 24/7, loving God, loving one another, and impacting the world through love and service. We should live out our Christian lives in every part of our life, worshiping, evangelizing, and discipling. But in all this, God is always primary. Everything is from him and through him and to him. We can only truly love our neighbors to the extent that we genuinely love God and are changed into his likeness. And that brings us to three aspects of our individual lives we need to consider in terms of the general goals we're aiming for. And we'll look at that under the familiar categories of head, heart, and hands. The way we think, the things we love, and the things we do as a result. History teaches us that a primary goal is that our minds would be filled with true God-centered theology, that our minds would be conformed to God's truth, that we would understand all the universe as God's universe, created for his glory. God's word should be our primary functional authority, and his revealed truth should be the standard and guideline for all our thinking. We should think about our world in terms of Christ crucified, more than we think of our world in terms of Plato, more than Aristotle, more than any Christian leader or anything else. And we can wisely distinguish what is most central from what is more peripheral. And the way we think also needs to have a profound effect on what we love. We saw, especially from Augustine, that our passions and affections are hugely influential. We should love God and not just acknowledge God. We should love our neighbor and not just put up with our neighbor. We can constantly ask ourselves and others, where is your treasure? And what is your heart pursuing? And is that what your heart should be pursuing and treasuring? And we've also seen throughout history that people act out what they believe and what they love. We also should put our faith into practice. James reminds us that faith without works is dead. Our Christian life should be lived out in tangible ways in every part of life, because Christ impacts our head, our heart, and our hands. The early church, the great leaders and reformers throughout history, have kept or rediscovered the truth of Christ. They've loved Christ and his priorities, and they've lived it out in a way that changed their world. And we can follow their example and do the same. Now, those are a few ways for us to summarize the godly goals we've seen demonstrated in history. And that brings us to some general dangers we've seen in history, which we should also beware of falling into. As a matter of fact, Jesus clearly warned us about these dangers. In Revelation chapter 12, we learn that the devil, symbolized by a dragon, was kicked out of heaven, and he was filled with wrath and hate, and set out to pursue and make war against God's people. And then in Revelation chapter 13, we learn of two general ways he will do so, which we've also seen played out in history. First is the symbol of a beast coming out of the sea, which is a standard biblical symbol for worldly empire. This beast demands worship of itself and the dragon, and uses oppressive government powers to punish anyone who does not conform. And then is the symbol of a second beast coming up out of the ground. He looked like a lamb, but spoke like a dragon. And he used deception and did miraculous signs. And he exercised social and economic pressure to influence people to worship the dragon. Now, most scholars liken this symbol to a false prophet within the church, deceiving and trying to influence people away from God while appearing to be harmless. And like I said, we've seen these warnings coming true throughout history. We've seen dangers from outside the church in the form of persecutions, the influence of ungodly society and ideas, and aggressive false religions. We've seen this in the early persecutions. We've seen this in the invasions from Germanic tribes and Muslims. We've also seen this in how the ungodly church persecuted and executed the medieval reformers who stood against their ungodliness. And we see it in many places around the world today, where Christians are persecuted and killed for their faith. And we've also seen dangers arising from inside the church, which affected the institution as a whole. This has been seen in the early heresies, such as Arianism, and there's been way too much corruption, coveting, and abusing of power. And there's a continuous temptation of professionalization, secularization, elitism, and a culture of celebrity in the church, as well as trusting in human wisdom and methods to achieve spiritual results. There has been no shortage of false prophets and beasts working within the institutional church throughout the ages. And we've also seen problems from the inside of individual Christians, primarily affecting the individual, but always spilling out to harm the people around them. There's been no shortage of hypocrisy, heresy, apathy, legalism, sin, traditionalism, and just going through the motions. Many Christians through history and continuing today have become too comfortable in this world, or they live in fear and non-belief, or they compromise with sin, and we all need to protect against these dangers as well. And finally, there are problems inherent in the passage of time. The Christian life calls for faithfulness in the long haul and regular return to what is important, because we all have a tendency to drift if we're not careful, and drift is always away. Whenever we coast, we always coast downhill. And throughout history, people have lost their first love, forgot their first principles. People have ignored God after they found prosperity in God. And we're all tempted to seek meaning and joy in other things beside God and his mission. History is full of mission drift, of love growing cold, and people just assuming and then forgetting the gospel and replacing it with something else. All of these are dangers that Christ warned us about, and we've seen them all in history, and we should guard against them all in our own lives. But of course, it's not all bad. There are plenty of victories in history for us to draw upon and to imitate. And so now we'll review some general positive principles that we've seen and should apply. First is what I'm calling worldview, goals, methods. Our worldview, that is, what we think is real and true and ultimate, that drives our goals, that is what we're trying to accomplish or get, and that drives our methods, how we're trying to do it. And our theology drives our affections and actions, and our primary functional authority defines all these things. Therefore, we should take care about our worldview and functional authority, because everything else flows from this. But the good news is that we have a true worldview, and we have a source of authority revealed from God Himself. And we've seen the glorious impact in history when God's people put this true worldview into practice. Next, gospel unity and cultural variety are both good and necessary. Genuine unity requires all sides to conform to a higher loyalty. And for true church unity, that higher loyalty is God Himself and His revelation. History teaches us that we can never seek unity at all costs, because in that case, we will pay a high cost and not attain real unity. But at the same time, neither should we try to have uniformity in everything. There should be freedom to serve Christ in ways that are most appropriate for different times and different places. Therefore, unity of heart around the gospel is more important than uniformity of practices or unity of organization. And there have been great examples in history of the church thriving in different lands and in different times and cultures, because God is great enough to save anyone and to be worshiped in every language and every place. And related to that is the principle of contextualized without compromise. We should respond to changing times, but never be married to the times. We should meet people where they're at, but not leave them there. We should be in the world, but not of the world. You know, the church in the early Greek era did not look like the Latin medieval church, which does not look like the church in Africa or the New World. We don't need to be exactly like any of those expressions, because, for instance, I don't live in medieval Rome. We can and should be flexible to adapt our styles and practices to the times and places where we live. But in none of those cases should we take our ultimate cues, our ultimate goals or authority from our own time, place, and culture. Our citizenship is in heaven, and our authority is from God. Therefore, we can live and influence anywhere, but we cannot ever compromise the timeless truth of God for anything in a temporal society. Whether our current culture agrees with God or not, therefore our theology should drive our apologetics and not vice versa. Next, the quality of leaders determines much of the quality of the church. It's not about power, but how the power is used. You can do much good with worldly power, or you can do much harm with worldly power. And you can do much good without worldly power, and you can do much harm without worldly power. Therefore, the church should be careful about the kind of people it puts in leadership. Don't elevate someone just because they're somebody's brother, or they're good looking, or they have an outgoing personality. Now, of course, being somebody's brother or good looking shouldn't disqualify anyone either. My point is that those kind of things should have no bearing one way or the other on choosing leaders. Rather, leaders should be carefully vetted based on the clearly taught biblical qualifications. And Christian leaders, once they've been selected, should strive to be extraordinary, even in the ordinary tasks and roles of Christian leadership. Extraordinary in character, and extraordinary in skill, and extraordinary in faithfulness, and extraordinarily careful with accountability and safety structures to protect them from their own sin. Because history has shown that the quality of leadership matters for the quality of the church. And another principle we've seen throughout history is that conflict is normal. Jesus promised resistance and struggle and opposition, and we should get used to it. We have an enemy of our souls, and as the world hated Jesus, it will hate us. Conflict is normal, and it is impossible to be neutral. If you are not overcoming and standing firm on God's side, then you're surrendering and working against God's purposes. However, we should also realize that conflict can be good. It can sharpen us. The challenge of heresy motivates us to know what we believe even more clearly. The challenge of persecution gives us opportunity to demonstrate our faithfulness and find strength in God, which we did not know was possible before. And conflict can also be good in that it gives us opportunity to convince the outsider of the truth, because we do take the opportunity to defend and prove the truth of Christ, and to convince the outsider of the reality and value of our God because of our willingness to give up everything for his sake. We've seen throughout history the roller coaster is a reality. It is just typical of all human endeavors that sometimes are better and sometimes are worse. We've seen times of compromise and times of reformation. The roller coaster is typical, but not inevitable. Knowing this, we should plan for it and protect against it. Always do reality checks, and if compromise or coasting begins to happen, try to reverse it as quickly as possible. Repent and return to your first love. Remember that corruption is easier than reformation, so try to recognize it and stop it before it gets too bad. Beware of mission drift, beware of love growing cold, and beware of downgrading or ignoring orthodox theology, and be prepared to counter any drift you see. And the final and most important general principle is that God is faithful. Jesus is building his church. He has been for thousands of years, as we've seen, and he continues today. Through all the ups and downs we've seen in history, God is still working out his eternal purposes. In Revelation, we saw the warnings of opposition and danger, but now let me remind you that we also see the clear promise that God wins. And God's people who remain faithful to him will share in that victory. Therefore, we should seek to be led and empowered by God in all that we do, knowing that he is Lord of all history. All right, those are some general principles I think we've seen in our survey of church history. And now I'd like to suggest some general strategies that all God's people should learn from history in order to live in a way that is most pleasing to him. First, guard your primary functional authority. Now, hopefully I've harped on that enough throughout this course so that you know what I mean by that phrase, but also so that you recognize the need to do that, and so that you see and desire the benefits of keeping the Bible as your authority. As we've seen, when the church keeps the Bible central, it is healthy. And when anything else becomes the driving authority, rot begins to set in. And related to that, we should keep God's gospel purposes central. God's purpose in history is to redeem a people for himself from every nation. And Jesus clearly commissioned his people to go and make disciples of every nation. The church should always be built on that foundation and work toward that goal. Don't ask God to be a part of what you're doing, but ask to be a part of what God is doing. In other words, don't try to fit God into your plans, but try to conform yourself to God's plans. Be proactive in proclaiming the good news and making disciples, rather than being reactive to every news cycle or changing cultural fad. Always keep an eternal perspective, and don't let circumstances set the agenda of what you are all about. Fight the pendulum swing and roller coaster by knowing clearly who you are and whose you are. Know what you're for and why, and what therefore you need to stand against. Third, don't drink from the toilet. Now, I explained that illustration in an earlier module, but it basically means that we should not settle for anything less than the very best possible. Don't compromise with falsehood and heresy, but hold out for and pursue the undiluted truth. Don't compromise with sin and half-heartedness, but hold out for and pursue wholehearted devotion. Jesus is the very best, He's Lord over everything and deserves all that we are and all that we could ever be. So we as his people, bought for a price, we don't need to settle for anything less. And therefore, we should fight the good fight in every part of life. We should fight defensively and offensively. Stand against falsehood and sin, and don't give it a place in your life, and do what you can to protect the people around you. And stand for the truth and holiness, and pursue it, and model it for others, and encourage them in their own discipleship. We should proclaim the truth and good news of Christ, and model it so that people can see and glorify God. And we should also fight at a worldview level. Now, we might need to fight at the level of details and particular issues. I have no problem with that. But we should primarily fight at the level of first principles and the underlying theological foundation. Remember the iceberg. Our behavior ultimately flows from our theology. So fight for good theology, and behavior will eventually flow out of that. And when we follow God's purposes and fight the good fight, that means we should also be willing to stand against evil. And that means we might need to stand against the world. Christians should suffer well when necessary as a part of our witness. We should be countercultural when necessary to demonstrate the truth. We should affirm human culture, but never put our hope in human culture. And we should be willing to forsake human culture whenever it contradicts or competes with Christ. You can use, but don't ever trust in things of the world, like images and cultural methods. Treat power as stewardship, but never trust in power. And if everyone else falls into falsehood and unfaithfulness, don't go with them. Rather, stand with Athanasius against the world. Stand on God's side, no matter where the world is standing. And the final strategy I want to suggest is to live and serve in light of who God has shown himself to be, and all that he has revealed that he is doing in all of history. And use God's given means of grace. Proclaim the truth whenever you have opportunity. Pray for God's strength and guidance. Take sin seriously, but also take God's grace even more seriously. In applying these things, beware of legalism or the idea that it all depends on me. Rather, focus on the good news of what Jesus has already accomplished for us and how he is continuing to work in our lives and to build his church. And then joyfully try to take part in what he is doing. Always focus on eternity and let your eternal destiny influence the way that you live every day as you continue to make history. Those are the general strategies that I'm suggesting, and all of the general lessons that I'm trying to summarize from all of our historical study. And that brings us to some final discussion and application questions. First, in light of all that you've seen from history, what does that tell you about the current state of the church and our surrounding culture? How does our time compare to what we've seen in history? In the range of faithfulness and strength to compromise and weakness that we've seen throughout history, where's the current church sit? How is our current time similar to what we've seen in history, and how is it different? Second, in light of what you've learned from history, what do you understand more clearly about your own life and why? What is the most pressing urgency in your situation? What is the most pressing opportunity in your situation? And what is the most strategic long-term urgency and opportunity that you see in light of what you've learned from history? What events and principles have you learned from that leads you to see your current situation in that way? Describe the connections you see between the history you've learned and the insights about your own life. And third, what principles have you learned from history that stand out as addressing a current need in your own life or in the situation that you see in your context? Why does that stand out to you? What people or events from history have you learned that principle from? And what strategy stands out as currently necessary in light of the principles that you've learned? And what strategy stands out as necessary for the long term? And describe how you will put that into practice in your own life and ministry. And finally, the open-ended question, what else have you learned, and how do you plan to make personal application of what you've learned? All right, that's all for this section, and for this module, and for the first History of Christianity course. There's much more history after what we've covered, and that will be addressed in History of Christianity 2. But I'll say it one last time concerning the time period included in this course. There is so much more in history than we have been able to examine, but I hope this has given you a general overview of some important items, as well as a taste for the benefit of learning from history and a desire to learn more. And I pray, as always, that God would give you insight as you work through and apply what you've learned, so that you would know Him more, and so that you would delight in all that He has been doing throughout history, and so that you would live in anticipation of what He continues to do in your life and in our larger history, and so that you would live wisely in light of who our God is and what He is doing throughout history, and so that He would be glorified in His people, continuing to make history by living for Him. So I urge you, as a result of all you've learned, to love and serve Him more, trusting that He is leading history to a wonderful end and to a glorious eternity that has no end. Thanks for watching.